Hello everyone, sorry that we're late today. Seems there were some technical difficulties with our restream from with the stream itself. But today we have Kansuki Dynasty with us. Normally she streams the Mish-Mash Lounge, but fortunately this content is also shared with Amara _MK and is being rebroadcast from her channel to our main group 2_MK channel with full permission. Today we're looking at two different ways of imitating in order to gain more skill in this game. There's imitating your own style with one character on another to get some insight as to how that works, why the character you normally play is strong, and what you are giving up on or what you gain by changing to the new character. On the other side, we'll also be looking at what happens when you attempt to take someone else's style and adapt it to your own, even if you're not necessarily using the same character. But in this case, we're going to kind of do both of those things at the same time. So in Amara's case, she's going to be working on imitating her Ryu style with Ed, which is difficult if you look at it head on, because the two characters, while they do share a lot of similarities, there are definitely some things about them that are different enough to make it hard to play one exactly like the other. In most good situations, you're going to end up pushing yourself too hard to get certain things done when it isn't actually working overall. Now this is partially good because Nash is generally a character that is dealt with by Amara's parrying, which Ed doesn't have available at all. However, what we've been working on a bit earlier today is the tendency to hit V-skill without letting go of buttons. It's fairly easy for Amara to get into the feeling that she needs to hit V-skill from neutral, because it's just an easy feeling to get into yourself, especially when you're practicing parrying a lot. You tend to just hit the parry button and not much else, which can get you into the habit of hitting parry with no other buttons. However, Ryu's parry works as long as you hit any grounded button, and Ed's is similar. As long as you're hitting any grounded button, Ed will do one of his two versions of his V-skill. What we're going to be trying to do today is the fact that Ryu parries with his V-skill when most people jump at him. Ed, however, is not quite so quick, so it's harder to defend yourself with his V-skill, but if you're holding down bat anyway, you can just hit his V-skill for jump-ins and something good will happen. The problem is that the difference in speed is important. The question now, therefore, is it that Amara can't specifically do this based on the timing, or is it that she has trouble doing it because she's not used to doing it that way? This is really important because you shouldn't actually let yourself play characters where you have to spend a lot of time shifting very similar muscle memory into a different time frame. Most people do much better when their main characters and secondary characters have relatively different execution, or a lot of overlap in execution and then some drastically different execution in terms of what the things they do are for. So in Ed's case, it's actually kind of not like that. Ed has stuff that he does that's approximate to what Ryu does, but it's actually slightly different in how it comes out, but not particularly different in how it's executed. So the timings are different. The timings can be off. some of the moves don't work in the same spacing, but they do work, and you can't just give them up. This means that you can spend a lot of time doing half of what you normally do, and then getting into trouble with something failing because you can't do the other half safely. One example of which is that part of Ed's combo system is very similar to Ryu's, but there are other parts of it that are just a little bit off. And for example, you can't parry that as easily. Since this is, of course, a battle lounge mostly intended for learning, it's pretty clear that she's going to keep on trying with it, even though it's not necessarily the best idea at the moment, just to see whether or not it works out in the end. On the other side, we have Kanzuki Dynasty playing Cammy, but rather than her attempting to mimic her own style with Karine, for example, because the two are similar, she already has basically worked out between the two of those how to make sure she does the correct thing. That's what you get when you bring up two characters basically next to each other. You build up the muscle memory and the thoughts and all those things. However, there are usually parts where things are a little bit off, and in footsie characters it's a little bit harder to see this. But in this case, we're going to be looking at how to play Cammy in what is a hybrid between my current Chun-Li style and my regular Cammy style, but I don't play Cammy anymore. The primary important thing to do when you're imitating my Cammy style is to recognize that pressure is your enemy. Your aim is to knock your opponent down, but then not do anything with it. Now, this generally comes off as, well, this is a terrible idea because she's a rushdown character, she's supposed to apply pressure. But honestly, a lot of the way that Cammy applies pressure doesn't actually work unless you know a lot of pressure strings. Similarly to Chun-Li, if you're really good at your pressure strings, you get more out of it. But if you don't have very good control over your pressure strings, then you don't get much out of pushing on people other than randomly hurt when they happen to do something that wakes up against you. One way that this helps you is if you happen to be very, very good at either anticipating your opponent or reacting to their movement with the correct button. So in a way, it becomes difficult when your opponent is really good at footsies themselves, or just at tricking you somehow. It's also difficult to play against zoners because a lot of good zoners know how to be patient enough to just sit there and wait for you, and you have to take the life lead and keep it. Which with Cammy is a little bit harder because even if you have one single trade against a character of higher health, chances are that you are now at life deficit and can't win on time. Here, for example, 10 seconds of the match is already gone, but there's really nothing you can get out of it this way. The problem with this style of Cammy is that it's hard to feel out when to use her moves. For example, that. When you stay still, your opponent also gets to stay still. Your opponent gets to think about what they want to do, and they get to think about what you potentially want to do and how to get past you. But if you are good at faking them out somehow, it becomes a simpler task to actually damage them overall. For example, in this case, you can just do nothing a lot of the time. This is actually something that comes up really often when you are activating your V-trigger. Unfortunately, Chun-Li is no longer a good character for this, but Cammy is. Cammy is a character for whom activating V-trigger is very likely to make their opponent keep still, because she's so much more dangerous in terms of her ability to react to other people's stuff that they tend to push on her and make her have to get hit.
I don't know if you can all see it on your side, but this is super laggy here.
We can see a lot of lag, yes.
Good. I'm not alone. Now
It's relatively interesting that it has gone in this direction, because as far as I can tell, it didn't lag the last time you fought them.
Indeed, not at all.
Seems to be clearing up though, so probably won't be too discouraging for anyone.
Oh man. That's head. It only takes one. So there we are. And now if it's laggy against Amara, we'll know something is up on my end, and if it's not, we can suspect something is up on his.
So the benefit of having Amara as an opponent now is that we also get to show off the quote-unquote problem with the style. When you're playing this style of character overall, you are really looking for that moment where your opponent has made a bad move and you are ready with some really quick reaction that they were hoping you didn't have. But against zoners, this is usually not even possible. They have the capacity to stay at the other end of the stage and pummel you for as long as they feel like, really. It doesn't give you any advantage in the standard way. However, both Cammy and Chun-Li happen to have decent ways to deal with this. Chun-Li's problem with zoners is not so much the fireballs they throw out, but a certain part of her own game plan that is predictable in Street Fighter V. But it's not really as if she has a problem getting in on people who use fireballs. It is specifically that she can't do it fast enough to win when she doesn't have the life lead. It's also a little dangerous if you don't have really good reactions on her crouch medium punch, but you're supposed to just work on your reactions at that point. That moment, for example, that button is what makes playing Cammy in this style possible. It is so long. It is almost on the level of the length of Alex's normals, which is probably why it's around the same speed as Alex's normals. So as you can see, you can play with Cammy very much in this wall of normal style, but not when your opponent starts to move away from you a lot. At that point, you have to take many more risks with her spiral arrow. And that is partly what made me stop playing the character. I ceased to play Cammy when they basically made it so that spiral arrow became incapable of hitting low at any point of its progression. Because in Super Turbo, everything basically had... There were no real flags for moves to say this hits here and this hits here per se. It was mostly hitbox interactions. So if the hitbox for the spiral arrow ended up low, then it technically counted as a crouching move. I don't remember where exactly this was changed, because I know that I played her in Alpha 2 Gold too, but that might have been the point where I was transitioning to realizing I shouldn't do this anymore. Now, Cammy here has a lot of ways of getting in, and she has a lot of ways of maneuvering around stuff that the opponent is doing that are very similar to the spiral arrow concept, but they're generally not as fast. So in order to play my style of Cammy in this game, you almost completely have to give up the idea that you can use meter for anything other than EX Spiral Arrow. Especially against zoners. It's not necessarily less true against other people, but it's definitely true against zoners. So there is the second part, the dancing around that allows you to say, okay, I'm just gonna hooligan now. It's further complicated by the fact that you must do this in neutral, and you must do this based on the feeling that your opponent is going to do something, or as a reaction to them actually doing something. And the part that makes it difficult about the reaction part is that it depends on what they did. If they are aiming to do something very fast, then it does no good to you. You end up landing before they actually... They end up recovering before you land, and you gain nothing from it. So the situation quickly goes away from your favor when this happens. And since you can't use meter for EX Wake Up, because you really can't afford to, you also have to make sure not to get knocked down. But at higher levels, this becomes even more difficult. Because at higher levels, your aim is to bait your opponent into doing things in neutral, and they have no particular reason to do anything that you can catch easily. You have to bait them into doing it by using buttons that they think they are going to be able to deal with in some way, as opposed to the regular buttons that you rely on with your character. The way this generally works out though, especially against characters who don't have a lot of reach, is that if you learn to hit with the very tip of your normals at almost all times, chances are you're not going to get punished. As a general rule, standard poking normals in Street Fighter, in almost all versions of Street Fighter, are not properly punishable by most people at their max range. They are whiff punishable, but good footsie characters don't leave their hitboxes out for super long, so they're hard to whiff punish in the first place. Or their hurt boxes are in relatively weird positions for the move in question, and it makes it harder for the opponent to use specific easy buttons in order to solve their problems.
I had no idea that that was going to hit that.
Well, our incoming beginner has said learning to fight Ryu, but actually is that thing altogether? Okay, well, we'll see.
I said what now?
I was wondering what the Battle Lounge had actually said about learning to fight someone.
I see.
But we can check on it.
Well, I will leave that to you for obvious reasons.
Mm-hmm.
I get to get a little bit more practice trying to deal with the monster truck.
So this is actually the other side of the situation. Abigail has longer normals than you. They're not super slow either. So at this point you have to evolve up to either whiff punishing, like that, or taking actions that are intended to make him hit buttons but not actually vulnerable. This is probably one of the easiest things to do on Cammy though. She is a character who is really well designed for it. You can just walk up to people and hit stand like kick and then do nothing. The only thing you have to worry about at that point is making sure that the stand light kick is either going to barely miss them or hit at the very tip. And you don't actually care if it hits. You only want that it either hits them or barely miss, but you just want to make sure you're not close when it's done. Why? Because they start to look for it. That's the general reason this sort of style works. It's actually really difficult to play for a lot of people because they're used to the idea that their opponent can't be conditioned in the way they want. Or they're used to opponents who hit so many buttons that if they don't space and time things perfectly, they'll end up getting hit randomly. Now, when you're in this situation where you're sticking out the light kick occasionally, all you have to do is hit the button just to keep track of whether or not your opponent is walking backward or forward, standing or crouching, all those things. And as soon as you recognize the scenario, then you can recognize whether or not you can do things like randomly hit ES, spiral arrow, or similar in neutral. Because if your opponent's aim consistently is to poke at you when you get close enough to light kick, then they're very likely not going to be blocking at the moment that you want to hit them with stuff. The two pieces of information are not really compatible. Your opponent can't both be waiting for you to do something, namely, and therefore in a state to block the kick, and in a state to respond to your light kick. The usual way that people play this is to give up on responding to the light kick and just let you poke at them indefinitely. Which is actually the superior strategy in almost every case. But that doesn't really mean the style is invalid, because there are other ways to simply be annoying or to keep people out of your space depending on what buttons they hit. You use the light kick to fish in order to see what buttons the opponent hits when they do think they're going to hit you. And if they hit nothing whatsoever, usually it means that they will not have particularly good reactions to something else you happen to randomly do. Just try something safe-ish.
Alright. So let's identify your opponents a little bit. But then, the trick becomes how to handle things once you have identified them. Or rather, what, if anything, you should shift at that point.
That is the part where understanding of either your character or your own personal preferred playstyle becomes super important. And it is also the second part of the reason why I dropped Cammy as a character in general. The way that Cammy played before, especially with some of the normals she had in other games, was not quite the same as she does now. The way she plays now is based on chaining together attacks and then attempting to cancel only when absolutely necessary. In certain previous iterations of Cammy, it was more so that Cammy's normals had more pushback, so she wasn't actually even good at doing what she does now. In fact, if you've ever seen Cammy played in Super Turbo, the consensus by most higher level people is she wasn't very good at much at all, because she had this problem. You have to be really dedicated to a very specific style of playing and a massive amount of information that you have to gain about every character in the game, basically, in order to seriously take on people with Cammy in that game. So Cammy is a character who can be used well by masters, but even then you're still at least some disadvantage. because there isn't a specific advantage she's being given in the game. She pokes at you and gets pushed out. And then if you decide, well, I have to get back in now, it's basically impossible on certain characters. But then again, this is from the Super Turbo era where that was a thing that could just happen. Matchups were a lot more lopsided when they were lopsided. And you didn't really have much chance of using a lot of your tools. You could play very well, and you could still win, but it was mostly repetition of very specific tools.
Sure.
So, the question becomes, can you play Cammy the same way in this game? Are there any normals that Cammy has that will cause your opponent to get set up? Or do you have to learn all of her poking setups to get out to that point? So far my answer is that you actually have to do the poke setups. The only move I've seen that both keeps you far out when she hits and is good enough to keep you safe when she's doing it is the same crouching heavy punch. The light kick barely moves you.
Yes.
But on the upside, as I noted, it does recover fast enough that it doesn't really matter. But that's all I've found. In fact, this is partly why I was able to play DiCaprio so much better than Cammy, because DiCaprio is a lot closer to that.
Yes, from what I know, there is some pushback on her various mediums and such, but I noticed this more on the level of, oh, I can't chain this because you were slightly too far out of the range. It's not really something that has a large amount of pushback most of the time that will get me out or be safe in that specific way.
So in order to help out our beginner, and to also look into the differences in terms of timing, Amara will go back to Ryu for a short time against his opponent. Since they've proven that they can definitely hold their own against that style of play, so we'll see if we can actually work out the difference in how the two need to play and what can be done on Ryu as muscle memory and so on to make playing Ed easier. One of the things that made playing Ed easier was, as I think I've mentioned on a prior stream, the change to generally throwing medium punch fireballs with Ryu. Since it really doesn't often matter too much, I mean, you can speed it up, you can change it up, but you don't really need to have your default fireball be the heavy punch fireball. It's only important that it is either the medium or the heavy to deal with the opponent's speed and timing. And the reason this is helpful is because if you get into the habit of throwing your fireballs with your medium punch, then the problem that Ed has, where he can only do his fireballs in a specific way, is greatly reduced. So you basically changed the way you play your main character in a way that isn't too difficult for you, that you could adapt to quickly, in order to give a leg up for your secondary character. Imitation can go back in the other direction. One of the other reasons why this is useful for Ryu is simply a matter of which button you're ready to press quickly to Shoryuken, for example, or just happening to deal with people who dash in on you, that sort of thing. Another thing that can be done to make it a little bit easier for Ed when playing Ryu is to use axe kick more as a certain spacing of anti-air. This is not likely to come up in this match because using axe kick on Abigail is relatively difficult, but it is something you can just generally note, that if you use axe kick as your anti-air and you train yourself to do axe kick in a particular way, namely hitting 2 buttons instead of 1, then when you get into the same situation with Ed, you will be much more likely to be able to react with Ed's Psycho Rising as his anti-air and not have to worry about it. Unfortunately, there's really no way to get the difference between the two of them on their invincible reversals if you are trying to focus on being able to do the non-invincible version of Ed's Psycho Knuckle. You could train yourself to do EX Psycho Knuckle in similar ways, but if you don't hit triple buttons to do Ryu's EX uppercut, it's still not going to help you because it's not the same thing. And here we have that further problem of the massive reach allowed by Abigail, meaning that it's very similar to Zangief. If you don't push back on the space you get from fireballs, it doesn't help too much. But just as Ed has nearly no response to this, Ryu has less responses to it. And Amara has not had a lot of time to work with the Abigail bot herself in order to make sure she can deal with this sort of pressure and behavior.
That full screen dropkick though, well, 3/4 screen. In order to top him, I think you'll have to make someone who can actually reach all the way across.
One of the most important things for fighting a character like Abigail is also one of the most risky things. Both Cammy and Ryu have the strong capacity to just effectively whiff punish with uppercut.
I see. Yes, I suppose so, and Cammy has quite some range on that as well if she needs to.
The range itself is not generally needed. In fact, you can probably safely do it with the light one, simply because, and this is why it is not often known or seen, if you whiff punish with light uppercut and fail the whiff punish part, note this is only for whiff punishes. If you whiff punish with light uppercut and fail on a long range move, the chances of the move having a recovery short enough for you to be seriously punished for your uppercut are actually relatively small in this game as a general thing. People have to be ready to do specials, and that's just like getting hit with a special in neutral. And how risky is that really, depending on what you're trying to do? So here, for example, your Fangbot experience is not going to help because this particular person is specifically making sure that they don't use any sequences. And as a result, every time you attempt to get in on them in a regular way, you will fail. But there's always stuff like that.
They're not making sure they don't use what now?
They don't use sequences that you can learn to get through.
Okay.
Notice that in that case, they did not throw the second Ishikyu. And even though they could have done it on reaction, they were probably mentally primed to just not do it. So he's going to zone you. He's not going to give you much space to do much of anything. But what you never learned on Cammy is that for characters with slow back jumps, a heavy spiral arrow will clip them on their landing before they can do much about it. So if your opponent decides to move away from you by jumping back, you can usually just clip them. Similarly, the thing you just did where you have put yourself close to them but not necessarily unsafe, and then just immediately hooligan, is a relatively useful response. You just don't actually do the dive kick because the dive kick is supposed to be treated as a pressure tool. What you want here is to simply walk toward him and then just hooligan randomly. Especially in a situation like that where you have already, by nature of the style, spaced yourself out too far for your continuations and combos to consistently hit. So there's really no point, you just hooligan. A lot of the time you can decide in the air whether or not it's worth it to go for the razor edge slicer from there. And the answer is usually yes. Not because your opponent can't handle that move, although it does tend to be safe enough that they have to deal with it. It is simply because if you make them think hard enough about the fact that you might do it, all those other slower buttons that you want to use become more useful. They don't want to play full-on footsies with you anymore. And you can get them to hit strange buttons such as that. Again, this is something that stops being useful as much when you get to higher levels, and which is why if you want to play that style, you probably need a character more suited to it, like Chun-Li or certain styles of Rashid and Colleen. And Alex, I suppose, but we can't really judge that yet.
Alright.
But you'll notice that even your EX ones are not being punished. So the primary strength of this opponent is actually simply that they can throw down Ryubenda and be fairly sure that you're not going to get through it. That's their goal at this point. But it's not a strong goal, because it takes them a certain amount of time to be ready to do that, and you can then focus your own style on countering that specific amount of time in much this manner, actually. But here, going for the pressure is precisely the thing that will get you hurt and reset the situation in their favor. You had the life lead, so the style would suggest stay still, do nothing, you win.
Alright. I think that my heavy spike would have done that, but alas, it did not come out.
I believe it's quite nicely possible to do that, because the heavy spike should have invincibility on frames 3 to 6, I think, still against attacks and projectiles, which is basically why it actually has those properties, so that you can do it from decently long range and expect things to work out. Well, since our beginner Ryu has stepped out, we'll see if we can continue with the Ed play on this side. Because actually, to some extent, Ed is stronger against Zangief and Abigail than Ryu is, until you've gotten a certain set of things with Ryu. And what better way to get those concepts with Ryu than by playing Ed, who is slightly better at them. You get more practice, you get more payoff for your attempts. Well, actually, I don't even know if they're going to play Abigail, but you get the idea. Oh, we have the Ed mirror, which is actually probably good.
The Christmas
So now,
conundrum.
there's zero difference between the two players other than their styles. Because by my analysis, while this player is quite good, they are approximately equal in level to Amar. I wouldn't expect that they, for example, knew more Ed combos or more Ed tech than much. I think they're just going to play Ed the same way they play everyone. You're mostly seeing simple things at this point. But again, the key problem is what one does with Ryu does not carry over to Ed in the defensive situation. And being a defensive player, Amara finds it harder to deal with this sort of thing because knowing exactly where to stand and how to deal with a particular movement can become really difficult there. Ed is also not really a character with a lot of moves. Ed is specifically based on getting away from people and utilizing his various simpler moves to get through the match. He's one of those characters where if you don't want to feel limited with him, you have to be very, very willing to use his V skill at times that most people would not be comfortable doing. A matter between the V skill and the heavy punch, mostly. Because nothing else in Ed's arsenal is going to give you any advantage over any other Ed. This is basically what a lot of old school people would call pure Street Fighter. This is what Ryu versus Ryu used to look like. Now it doesn't look like that at all because obviously you still have ways of... You have multiple ways of dealing with your opponent's fireballs. Ed has less. And the general expectation of any Ed player is that the other one is going to throw the fireball as soon as they can. So it's very unlikely you're ever going to hit anyone with it except if they're very, very aggressive. You can imagine what this used to be like before there was such a thing as ES fireballs. And yet this is still a meaningful form of Street Fighter in terms of letting you understand when you have to make motion and when your opponent has to respect your motion. One of the main important things though is actually to recognize that your ability to knock the opponent down becomes way more important when you are in a mirror match. Not because you specifically intend to apply pressure to them, but because it gives you the massive positioning advantage. And understanding what the positioning advantage for Ed is also helps with understanding the positional advantage for Ryu, even though their normals are not particularly similar. The same applies to Cammy really, but the way that Cammy utilizes her knockdowns is obviously encouraged to get right up in your face and hit as many buttons as she needs to hit to move you to where she wants you to be. This is really effective once you've learned all of those sequences of buttons. Before that, it's a bit stressful.
And there are a lot to learn.
So the key to understanding this Fong is to understand one thing that is not clear and is not part of your style as a natural thing so far. In order to beat Fong, this particular Fong, you have to walk forward.
Aha. Yes, that's not something I was going to think of against, well, this particular Fong, honestly.
Of course, this only works when you're not under pressure, so at the moment that's not what I'm saying. But right there, for example, that is the moment where you have to walk forward. Because it is the moment when he must decide what to do. If you dash, he immediately knows I have enough time to do my move before they can start another move that will specifically get through this one. If you walk,
I see, but if I'm...
they're not really sure what's going to happen.
Indeed, because I can stop at any time.
And the normals that Fang is likely to hit to deal with you walking forward are not necessarily the normals that this particular player is interested in trying to use. This is why Cammy and Karine and Chun-Li have such good walk speed as a general thing. It is to allow them to reposition and actually play this form of game in lieu of their other ways of doing massive damage. There are certain characters against whom they don't stand up well if they don't have the ability to easily move in and out of range to use their normals. Every dash you do is likely to lead to that sort of thing, actually. Now, the fearlessness required to also be the person who does stuff like that and just not be afraid, because you recognize I'm in position. Whatever is keeping me from reaching you is eventually going to disappear. That's just going to happen. By the nature of the game, the thing that is keeping me away from you is going to disappear. Either you have walked back out of my range more, and I will keep on walking forward, or you're going to try something to the effect of attacking you, and I'm going to react to that. The primary reason why we have trouble with this when we're starting out the game is because we are taught blocking is how you defend. We feel as if we must always be ready to hold back as quickly as possible to make sure we don't get hit. But that is not actually true and not the core principle of fighting games. Blocking is not the first method of defense. Not being there is the first method of defense. So, being able to recognize when your opponent has moved themselves out of the range that they can hit you from, and therefore you no longer have to worry about blocking, is super important to playing this sort of game. After that, you work on figuring out when your opponent doesn't think of hitting buttons to hit you with, and then you recognize you don't need to block then either.
And it looks like Cosmic Wolf will be ready to join us momentarily.
Well, as we are the streamer, I'm going to leave that to you. I believe that everything would work out fine if you did all the inviting as well.
Certainly hope so. It seems that I can, in fact, send the invitation. So he should now be able to join up when he is ready.
Okay, then let's proceed. So far, our guest Nightmare has shown the capacity to play Ed at the base Ed level, the capacity to play Abigail at a slightly above base level, and some decent Fang skill, I'd say. Not like I'm terrified of this Fang, but they certainly know how to keep their own spacing right. Which in this case I will say makes them the perfect person to be in this lounge at this time. So, thank you to them for joining up with us and letting us get this particular experience for this particular stream. Now, in the Fang matchup versus Ed, the situation isn't really different from the Cammy matchup. You have to walk forward. There's no choice. The difference is that Ed doesn't have as good a way to quickly clip Fang while doing that. In fact, he has to rely, interestingly, on his V skill uncharged a lot in order to get anything. He has to do it from a range where Fang can't really respond. And this is hard to set up under most circumstances because Fang can just put down the rear bender in front of him. And there's, unlike Cammy who has at least some way around it, Ed basically has no way around that at all. But Ed does have one part of it that really helps him. Specifically the fact that when Fang has dropped a Ryobenda, if you immediately, no matter where you are, charge your V skill on the ground heavily, the moment you see him do it, if you are walking towards him and you respond by instantly just full charging a standing V skill, Fang doesn't really have anything he can do. There is why, because Fang can't do Nishikyu quickly enough to hit Ed without getting grabbed. That's the primary thing. So he has to now change his matchup and pull Ed, deal with Ed when Ed is down. He has to knock Ed down before he can safely put down that poison cloud. Which means Ed gets to flatly just walk forward. And once Ed starts to walk forward and Fang realizes he really doesn't have a lot of options in how to keep Ed out, this sort of thing happens. Because who cares about a poison cloud between you and Fang if you can pull Fang to you? But you must mentally then recognize, okay, when it's in front of me, because I was on the ground, I can't do this anymore because clearly he'll be ready for whatever. But as you can see, this particular setup changes the whole matchup. And actually Ryu does have a similar response. Ryu does have something he can do that is similar to this. It is mainly that Ryu's must be done on a different timing, unfortunately. And therefore, Ed experience won't carry over. Which is probably good because, thankfully, they're not the same button. Unfortunately, again, if you dash, that will happen and you can't actually get closer because then you've blocked the Ryobenda and the situation has changed. But Fang is good at keeping you out of his space, and you just have to recognize and respect that. But most of us are very good at getting Fang back into our space if we're playing Ed, because if you think about Fang's options here, Fang has precisely one option, and most people don't have the skill to execute that right. There you go. So that's what we're going to probably see now. We're going to see some adaptation to dropping Ryobenda and then doing that. Or, well, actually I didn't expect the Sotoja, I figured that would come through. But once again, your knockdown game, your damage game, all of these things become phenomenally more important because most of the time a counter to an opponent's style is just a gateway to a bunch of other things you need to do. And that happens no matter who you're playing, and it can be really discouraging on characters when you're learning styles, and that's why it's so important that when you see someone do something to solve a situation, don't just take that information and go, okay, I know how to deal with that move now. That's great. Watch the entire thing. Watch what they spend time doing after that and how much effort they put into things like pressure, things like how they use their meter. Because you can't imitate just that piece. You can't say, oh, I didn't know that that move beat that move. Cool, now I can deal with all those situations. No, because you've created a new situation that is most likely extremely unfamiliar to you as well.
After all, if that situation wasn't unfamiliar, you have to wonder why you needed assistance getting there to begin with. That's a really nice color.
I just muted the mic for a bit, so I'm just double checking that I'm audible again.
You're live.
To go further into that, even if you are the type of person who insists on developing all your own strategy so that you know all the steps that were taken, you don't want to just imitate people's style wholesale and go, okay, they did this, I'll do that too, without fully knowing why, you can still get a lot out of a lesser form of imitation. In fact, not really imitation at all. We'll call it post-mortem imitation. When you come up with the response yourself to a situation because you couldn't figure out how to do it before, you didn't want to watch high-level players to just do what they were doing, for example. But if you've got anyone that does watch those sort of players, you can ask that friend of yours, well, hey, have you seen this person do this tech that I've just come up with? The internet is full of people who will be happy to tell you that your new tech is not new. And once you have that information, you can then go look at not so much the thing that they were doing after it. You don't have to pay attention to that. Pay attention to the situations they ended up in as a result of doing it. And save yourself some time if you, for example, can't play yourself. That sort of experience is what friends share often in this sort of game. Not so much, hey, this is how you beat this move, because high-level players know that telling you simply, this is the button to use to do this, is not necessarily helping you. They are going to set out to tell you, when you do this, this other thing will happen. Whether or not you want that thing to happen or not is a different matter. Seems we've got a little lag again, but I think that this person has recognized probably that it's on their side, and we're fine with it, so as long as they're willing to keep on trying. So the situation that the Fang player, for example, has recognized that he keeps on ending up in is that if he throws down Ryobenda and isn't ready enough, you get to do massive damage to him. He has to be ready for something, and the most of the some things he has available don't help.
I was so focused on the CA there that waiting for him to jump that I forgot to just EX through.
Mm-hmm. But
So
we
now
all
looking back
grow
at
and
this
learn in
slide-
that particular way. Meter watching, awareness. All those things that if you don't put a lot of effort into taking your bots seriously, you won't develop these skills, because the bots are meant to teach you those things, but only if you really think about it and don't just go, okay, I am going to try to get the points and I'll just count. You are trying to do things like get the points quickly, you're trying to do things like make sure that you know what you were doing at the time and how the bot changed your perspective on it. Otherwise, mostly you're just going to go, okay, I got to 10 points, that's good. And it's not as helpful. On the other hand, you have people who are very diligent about bots like OmniRabbit who don't even pay attention to points until they're pretty sure that they've found all the best ways to get them. A lot of experimentation goes on when Just Fine or OmniRabbit are dealing with new bots, because their goal is generally learn things with my normals that help me against this, not, okay, I'm just going to do what I always do against this and it should work because I have good execution. So once again, Ed has to walk forward. He can't really afford to dash. He can dash at the very end when you've gotten really used to Ryobenda spacing, but for the most part he can't dash. If you learn to dash through a fading Ryobenda, that's a really good high level for you, but I doubt that's going to happen. So what we're looking for here is a lot of spacing stuff. However, Ed does have one other weapon. Psycho Rising is projectile invincible for a large portion of it. And This allows you to get away from Fang doing Ryobenda very close to you on reaction. It's not an easy reaction by any means, but it is always possible. Also, if you can get close enough to him, you don't have to worry about Nishikyo at all. Basically, if you are standing on the other side of Ryobenda and Fang has not managed to hit a normal by then, the moment you see him move, there's a good chance you can just like a rising. But as you can see, that situation does not work out in Fang's favor. So if you walk forward behind him, you will get hit by Sotoja sometimes, but this is not terrifying for most players, especially since all versions of Sotoja except the EX are radically unsafe, and they become less and less safe the closer you're standing to Fang. If you happen to block it, he's in a lot of trouble. So he's actually counting on being able to get further away from you because you flinch, so that he can safely do it. He's not thinking, oh, this move is unsafe, I shouldn't use it. He's thinking, oh look, my range. The similar thing happens with Necalli's Disguidance, but is a little less likely to work out in Necalli's favor. Whereas Fang hits from so far and comes back so far that he really doesn't have to worry about it at all. Fortunately for you, there's an even better part of that. The damage he does with a Sotoja that only hits that way is so small you don't care. So at this point, again, he's counting on that spacing working out for him. But it doesn't necessarily. Slight lag. Probably should just defend it out for now. Once Fang has put himself in the corner against Ed, though, it becomes really easy to deal with him, especially if you have meter, because then Fang is one of the characters in the game that has no way to deal with you throwing your V-trigger at him when he's cornered himself. Unfortunately, it doesn't work as well unless he has actually cornered himself, so you don't end up with that advantage too much. Most Fang know how to hold the position they're in without a big fuss in terms of how much damage they're taking. But if you can push a Fang all the way back to the corner with Ed, especially since if you're playing normally against Fang with Ed, you build up a ton of V-meter. And you're never going to need your V-reversal for much. So you can just throw out the V-trigger and let him block it, but at that point, you've gone right up into his face, you have managed to close in on him, and now he has nearly nothing that will specifically get him out, other than him V-reversaling or using his snake crawl to get past. If you stand in just the right space and then dash, this will work almost automatically. So now we're going to gather a little bit of information about Urien versus presumably Fang, maybe. The Urien bot is actually quite far into its development, and we don't really think that there will be too many heavy changes. Obviously, because we have a Urien player who has contributed strongly, and a lot of people who have experience fighting online Urien to say, hey, this is what bothers me about them. But we're going to see what the zoning matchup here turns out like, because Urien is also a character who, contrary to nearly everything you would expect about his form, has to walk forward against Fang. You'd think this is everyone in the game, but no, it just happens to be characters you all play. He has no real way of getting advantage this way. Eventually he's going to end up either poisoned or getting clipped by something on his way in if he tries to use specials. And then from there, Urien's health is quite good, but Fang doesn't care anymore. Because if Urien does that and charges up his Metallic Sphere, to Fang this is really obvious. Okay, I'll just block longer. Meanwhile, Urien's health is disappearing. Why does Fang do this? It's just to build meter, really. I mean, who wants to block firewalls if you don't have to? This is one of the few matches where I almost can see why they don't raise Fang's poison damage. And here's one of the main reasons it's possible. Once you have put enough pressure on Fang, he's one of the characters against whom you don't need Aegis setups per se. Once he's cornered himself, it's much like Ed. Put the V trigger in front of him and wait, because he can't do a whole lot. His jump is super slow and very floaty. Not all jumps are both, but it is both super slow and very floaty. It's one of the few jumps that Urien can consistently anti-air without having to worry about it. So usually Urien's goal is just push Fang back fast enough that at some point he gets to use his stuff. The other option is really easy, but Fang will see through it relatively quickly, so I don't know if to suggest it. And this is also the reason why the bot does not in fact have any point at which it actually activates armor. We are still considering whether or not there's a way to do it, but right now I'm basically leaning against it. If, however, one activates armor and does chariot tackle after a forward jump, chances are Fang has done nothing that will get you. Because Fang does not generally hit his 2 hit buttons at that spacing or timing. You'd have to like lure him into it, and then he wouldn't be doing a bunch of other things that would be dangerous. So once again, it's actually a sort of battle of reach. And Fang, Abigail are really, really good characters to show this off on. Because he will just put that down and be out of reach very quickly. It's part of the reason probably why they didn't make it possible for Fang to go backward with his snake crawl style thing. One of the bigger reasons is that as soon as Fang lets go of down in order to jump away from an Aegis, for example, or tries to do his snake crawl, which is effectively a Shoryuken motion, with it directly in front of him, it takes quite a bit of execution to pull this off. It's a high level technique basically. And since his jump is floaty, Urien can chase him down quite a lot compared to most characters. However, this particular Fang is very familiar with their push out block strings, and therefore not so easy to pin down. But once again, we have armor directly in front of Urien, and no particular reason for Urien to actually do anything with that spacing. He's not likely to get more V-meter, so he might as well hold on to that and walk Fang all the way down, or annoy him as long as possible, or any number of those similar things, because you're not going to gain anything by throwing out the Aegis or even trying to quickly get an Aegis setup. It's just a matter of carefully jumping forward with the right timing and then doing something like that. Oh, it was so close, but he still clutched it out actually. I would probably have still put the Aegis in front of him, but that's because I calculate too much and don't go with my gut all the time. It is actually because I calculate so much that I try to play the other style. Putting pressure on people involves a lot of gut feelings. And while I'm quite good at analyzing situations, just knowing that the feeling of someone going to do this particular thing is harder when you are definitely putting them in defensive position. Because not a lot of people like staying in defensive positions. In fact, I think mostly just Daigo and Momochi are really well known for it. And there's the invincibility to get through the Aegis. Basically Fang's only solution to that problem. But a good one, because most of the time, if you're in the corner and the Aegis in front of you, you don't have many options other than to do that.
Alright, so I have now been playing a couple of rounds with him. Uh-oh. Okay. And so my question for you is, which things have I dropped on the floor? What have I forgotten or gotten lost here that I need to pick back up?
Well, in terms of them playing Fang, there isn't anything you have dropped per se. This is primarily because anytime you're learning a new matchup, the thing you have to learn first is how to shut down the main problem. If your opponent doesn't know how to pose the main problem, then everything's fine. But assuming they do, or that it's one of the core principles of their character, you're going to have to face it, and you're going to have to figure out how to beat it. And if you can't figure out how to beat it, then nothing else you actually learn or remember or have ever been told about how to play the character matters. This is where the simplify thing comes from. If you can't get past those things, your other abilities and other ways of fighting and other things you're thinking about, none of them matter even a little. As is somewhat being demonstrated here, unless you can get in on him enough to put up some form of pressure, you basically are just going to slowly die. You may manage to take off life, but you'll never be in control of the situation enough to make the opponent feel, I don't know what to do here. And that is actually really important. As soon as you've got an opponent to feel, even for a short time, that they don't know what to do, even if you don't win that round, you have a heavy advantage in the next one. This particular Fang is now facing, for example, the possibility that he can't hit buttons here. And you'll notice that he immediately checks to see whether or not he can actually hit buttons there, or if you were just lucky. Because now, in their mind, presumably, you hitting crouching heavy punch has become the thing that they are losing to, the thing that they can't stop, so they attempt to find a solution. Now that they've reassured themselves, oh, never mind, that's not real, I don't have to worry about that. Now you may see more regular play, but someone who has this level of what I would say learning skill, they know better than to just try that. So now they're just hitting crouching medium punch to get themselves out of the situation that you were creating via that setup. And you in turn must, as usual, figure out what to do against that. Fang is one of those characters against whom you cannot do double crouching medium kick. I suggest just randomly cancelling crouch medium kick into hooligan actually, because it's much easier. So as you can see, by not allowing yourself to pressure opponents as heavily or in orthodox ways, you force yourself to understand more about spacing and where you walk or don't walk. And you put more pressure on your opponent to pay attention to things like that, even though technically they should have the advantage. You're facing a zoner with a rushdown character with low health. Fang is not the strongest of characters, but until you get to a really high level with Cammy, I would say Fang probably has the advantage in the matchup. Because she doesn't even have enough invincibility to deal with most of his stuff. But of course there is the EX response to that, which I guess counts as the thing you dropped, sort of.
Sure.
Because you can literally just see him do Ryobenda and immediately EX.
Right. For some reason I wasn't thinking about doing that on reaction to it, which is probably my mistake.
You're facing the same situation as Ed though, where if you're not spaced correctly it doesn't work, and if you are knocked down when he throws it out, it's definitely not going to work. Most of the time you just have to sit behind the Ryobenda once it's been thrown out after you were knocked down. But yes, you can always basically just do that. And one of the stronger aspects of this style is that when you have done something like that, when you have gotten this random perfect knockdown off of something like that, you haven't done enough in terms of pressure up until that point for your opponent to actually be expecting it.
Sure. So that's the point where I can try for my meaties and my harassment.
However, there is one downside to it. A lot of the time when you counter someone's move, they are not ready to quick rise. At least at lower levels.
Then I don't get it anyway.
So you tend to have to know the longer meaties as well in order for it to make any sense.
Fair enough. And I don't have those yet.
But so far, the result of the imitation of the style is functionally just working. The difficulty you have is, as mentioned, the confidence to just walk forward and treat walking forward as a form of defense in itself. This is something that Zangief players, on the other hand, tend to master fairly early on.
Zangief walking at you is terrifying.
But it's terrifying for the Zangief as well.
It's very easy to not think of it that way if you've never been to Zangief doing so.
Actually, it's the same thing. The opponent, the Fang, is actually just basically just as scared of you walking at him as you are of walking at him. He's not thinking to himself, I have a solution to everything, I'm perfectly fine. Because if you are paying enough attention, you know what you're doing, so he doesn't get to get away with stuff.
Sure.
So a lot of this is based on hoping that things work out well. Things happen to be working out well, but that doesn't necessarily mean that he is doing particularly well. For example, you'll note that once again, the aforementioned V-trigger is available. If he gets pushed back into the corner, he's in trouble again, relatively speaking. And despite the fact that that round was mostly exchanges not in her favor, that took relatively long. Amara did not flatly just lose out in that scenario. Even at the highest levels, people are not simply prepared for everything. Similarly, as noted before, one of the things that is important in this matchup is the ability to recognize when you absolutely must go in for the meaty. Fortunately, Ed's meaty off EX Psycho Upper is quite good and easy. It's just dash dash medium punch. Now, for him to get in that situation, Unfortunately, he wasn't actually back against the wall because it would have been easier to deal with him then. But it still works out overall. The only problem there was unfamiliarity, because knowing that Fang must either jump or snake crawl through that means you can just wait for him to do one of those two things. And if he doesn't do it by a particular time, then just respond by attacking him. But again, it comes down to, is this comfortable for me? Am I used to doing this? Is this a skill I've built up on my primary character? The answer is usually no. Their defense, as you can see, is quite good. And that trade is in favor. So as you can see, once you've gotten used to the whole, hey, this is the way to deal with this situation, it becomes a lot easier to play the match itself. Whether or not you can beat the opponent is not really the question. Can you play the match? And the answer is flatly yes. We are considering, after all, that this can't possibly be about level of grinding or execution, because Amaro basically practices Ed once a week, if that. So to be able to go even with someone who, at least today, has been playing Fang and doing quite well the entire time, by changing one aspect of style that you understand, is relatively good. Now, in terms of your imitation of Cammy style, basically, this is something you have to put together piece by piece, as mentioned. So, the walking forward is one piece. The being ready to random EX arrow is another piece. The third piece is basically not functional on that particular Fang, and I'm not sure it's functional on Fang as a general thing, actually. Cammy doesn't hit stand medium kick against Fang that I'm aware of. I'd have to watch that sort of matchup to know for sure, but it doesn't seem as if either her stand light kick or her stand medium kick is actually that good against him, because he has a lot of moves that make him go quite low, and he has a lot of moves that move him backward, whereas it just puts forward a hitbox you can't deal with. So she's not really going to get to put on a lot of pressure on Fang and then go, oh, everything's better now.
Sure.
So while I would normally say, hey, mix up the crouch heavy punch with that, against Fang, and particularly this Fang, I wouldn't really suggest it.
Yeah, it would work a little bit, but not very much.
So if there was anything to work on, it would probably be the willingness and ability to whiff punish with the light kick cannon spike.
You faded out a little bit. What did I want to punish with light kick?
The light kick cannon spike.
Oh, okay, that.
Well, so far we're seeing shades of Urian bot. He was actually relatively easy to make. Good thing that is 2 hits. Now sometimes, of course, your character doesn't have a way to be imitated on another character very well. And if you really like your main, if you've reached a point of the game where your main is almost perfect and you're just trying out new characters for the sake of it, or just thinking they're aesthetically cool, then mostly it comes down to how much of their stuff that you like doing on your main is missing or available. If you're not too satisfied with your main at the time, one of the primary things you're looking for when you do this is to try to imitate the style you wish you could play on your main character with the new one. Every time you've said, I feel limited with this thing, just ignore it. Just ignore the fact that you supposedly had this limitation when you try your new character, and see what happens when they do the same thing. You should probably try a lot too. Give it as much time as you gave it with your main character, just so you could see something. And that's what lets you know whether or not you'll be able to play them better, worse, differently, or just not bother. Because Cosmic Wolf's style with Urien is very strong zoning and counter zoning, especially when he's like heavily in his element in this case, where that was expected, for example. That was expected because we had gotten to the point where the opponent had basically not gotten to use their meter due to being zoned out so much. That wasn't really, oh, I can't see a good spacing for this other than super. There were plenty of good spaces for it conceptually, but until you can actually do them, it doesn't matter.
Alright. It looks, however, like I'm going to get to try and put things into practice against Cosmic Wolf instead of our friendly Fawn. So I may have the opportunity to try a little bit different and add in the missing element that he kept me out of. So we're going to have to see how that goes.
Well, it also brings you to become more comfortable with certain inputs. It is actually very difficult for Urien's moves to be punished by your stand light kick, because your stand light kick or your light kick cannon spike, because chances are, given the length of Urien's normals and the way he retracts his hurt boxes, either he hit you or you can't hit him back. He's a relatively hard to whiff punish character, which is part of the reason why he's considered strong. A lot of characters with really good spacing can do it, but because they have to use normals that confirm into nothing, Urien basically ignores that. He just doesn't care. So against him, you need the stand medium kick.
Okay.
The crouch heavy punch is fortunately just as effective. In fact, it's very good to follow the stand medium kick with the crouch heavy punch, and you'll see why once you clip him with the edge of one.
Now, is this something I want to be trying to do preemptively at all? I suppose yes, but just
yes,
the correct
basically
range.
you are. Whereas with other characters, you're normally trying to hit the crouch medium kick in case they're not crouch blocking. Urien doesn't care. Urien is almost certainly going to be crouch blocking. And the rest is again just reactions. Because I would pride myself on that moment that just occurred with the Aegis in front of you and him charging for the fireball. That would be my EX spiral arrow moment. I don't care even if I bounce off him and get hit by the Aegis, I'm going for it, because that's what makes me happy about playing Cammy.
I see.
It might not be what makes you happy about it, but you could learn some stuff from it and then decide whether or not you were going to keep that stuff or not.
Unfortunately, it does that if I have to go through one in front of me.
But the reason that's useful is because Urian gets a certain amount of advantage even off an Aegis that doesn't hit you. He gets to keep the scenario in front of him, he gets to power up his armor, he gets to space himself however he prefers to. And you can get rid of that potential by clipping him like that. While having basically no threat to yourself, you take a very small amount of damage for that particular interaction with Aegis.
Indeed, it was a favorable trade, although not a large one.
And there you see why the stand medium kick is so effective. There's a range at which Urian gets pushed to, mostly by his own normals, where he can't start a special without Cammy being able to kick him. He can, however, start specials that get away from your crouch medium kick. At least that's my experience. And once you've seen the stand medium kick whiff, you know what to do. Which is basically usually nothing. It also removes the tendency we have of confirming the crouch medium kick into something. Because at this point you don't really care about doing more damage to Urian, you care about Urian not doing damage to you.
Right. And that worked perfectly, it was just a little incorrectly spaced.
Because Urian is a relatively straightforward character, he is mostly predictable in what he can and cannot do at certain ranges. He's just really, really good at those things. Given who plays him, this shouldn't surprise you. Unfortunately, it is only through confidence that you can attempt to continually do this sort of thing and weather all the times where it doesn't work out quite right because you are at slightly the wrong range.
Yeah. And it helps to be able to see that clearly, so once you have a feel for when the right range is. But it still definitely requires confidence of being able to be there and handle everything.
As we discussed prior, you did have an interest in figuring out how to focus on why your opponent is beating you more so than on winning the match itself.
Yes.
Why
I definitely have a problem where, and it is kind of a problem emotionally, where I do get stuck on trying to win or trying to figure out what they're doing so I can try to win or such things, but that results in my focus just not being available for the actual analysis, which is something I really need.
If you want to just practice for having fun or just practice moves, you can play against friends who you already know the fighting style of and you don't have to worry about that sort of thing.
Yes. And it would probably be a little easier in that case, although I suspect I have a tendency to get frustrated as well. But in terms of that, it's more or less just something one has to learn to deal with.
From the design perspective, there's a lot of reasons why this works out the way it does as well. For example, Urian has no 3-frame normals. This is useful because it means that you don't really need to charge the B skill to use it against him on Ed. You're much better off just flicking it and getting closer to him consistently using it. You don't get to do anything afterwards safely, but most of the time Urian is not going to do much either. So you can literally walk up to him and just tap B skill. Because when he does that instead, you really haven't lost out too much. This that particular exchange may feel extremely frustrating, but the damage didn't come from those interactions with the fireballs. The losing part of the game didn't come from that. All you would have had to do was land what you were aiming at once or twice, and it would have quickly evened out. Another thing that Urien is relatively weak to, especially when attacking him on Wake Up, is Psycho Knuckle, because he doesn't wake up with fireballs most of the time. So once you've gotten him down, it's fairly easy to Psycho Knuckle and deal with him. But getting in on him this way tends to be a lot harder. The problem is, as I mentioned before, this isn't really something that carries over. It's not a Ryu feeling that you can use. It is fortunately one of those things Akuma can use. Akuma can, at a particular range, convert that sort of thing that Ed does into a similar thing mentally. And to some extent Bison can as well, even though his V-skill is nothing like that. It gives him enough charge to get ready to do a move that will do it. But Ryu has basically no equivalent that looks like that. Ryu has to do things like try to move forward with medium Tatsu or light Tatsu and hope that Urien hasn't done something immediate to cause problems. And unless there is a way to get yourself to do Tatsu with the equivalent of the V-skill button, which does not work because V-skill will be the thing that comes out, there's no way to do it that way. You could attempt to somewhat reprogram yourself by actually doing the Tatsu motion and then hitting the V-skill. Just to associate the Tatsu motion with the range, because since it isn't quick, since the execution doesn't need to be on point immediately, in terms of when you hit the V-skill button, it doesn't actually matter whether or not you did the precisely correct backwards motion, or if you held the back too long, or any of those things. The change to Nash is also not unexpected because, again, this player seems to be strong in terms of the spacing required for zoning. And given that the bout between them before is not going to lead to much, this is probably the better outcome. And we have the Violence Knee trick up. Always fun to watch, but always confusing. So let's look at it from the same perspective of seeing what you could do with your style that would work against Nash if Nightmare continued to play Nash. They're definitely still a zoner player when they're playing Nash. They throw booms from very far away and wait for you to do something to respond to the thing you do. The easiest thing therefore is to make their response wrong rather than spending a lot of time worrying about whether or not the booms hit you. Or even worrying about stuff like that. That is a decent chunk of damage, yes. And it did lead into more, which is the bigger problem. But this doesn't really mean that you should be concerned about the sonic booms. Because if you were not aware, it takes approximately, I think sonic booms do 60 damage now. Until scaling kicks in which case they technically do 45 damage. So on average, it takes around, I believe, 14 sonic booms to kill you. But the problem here is the boom gets thrown and the response that he is prepared for is fairly easy for him because he doesn't have to watch his own character. He can just watch your character and where the boom turned up. And by doing this and making the scenario more specifically useful for himself, this situation occurs where he's able to continually move out of range because he knows you can't risk immediately chasing him. But at the same time, you can't specifically say, I'm going to get over these sonic booms because I know what to do after them. Because he's usually out of range for you to do anything per se. You saw that even EXNI would not reach. We did make a lot of effort to give Urian Bot the aforementioned EXNI, but it's not really for the purposes of him managing to get in on someone who has run to the outside of the screen. The scenario which Urian Bot has for this will probably be demonstrated tomorrow, and more likely to be seen when against OmniRabbit, because it's just generally clearer in terms of what he's trying to do out of block strings, out of general push overall. Fortunately, it seems that you get to continue fighting Fang because presumably I doubt the Nash matchup versus Cammy would go particularly well given that particular fighting style. That would just be a matter of you getting through with turn knuckle and building meter. One thing I suggest there when you do end up doing Hooligan over those is to just not press anything. The dive kick doesn't actually do anything for you.
Yes, I was using it to, I don't actually know. I sometimes use it to end it early so that I don't go the full distance, but not necessarily reason to do that here.
I'm not really sure that helps, no. And it's recognizing things like that and saying to yourself, you know what, I'll just take the damage. It's about the same either way. That's a very important thing to be able to feel in Street Fighter, as a general thing. When you're much, much better and in much worse situations, you can worry about optimizing so that you take the least possible damage. But most of the time, if you have two options where one might work but hurts slightly more, you usually use that one. So as you can see, this matchup overall just becomes easier over time the more you're willing to walk forward. And the more of your focus is therefore able to deal with anything else he does because you reduced the advantage part of the match to simply, hey, I'll walk forward. Now this might at least be partially, at least very slightly, about the fact that, oh, many people attempt to stand block the dive kick part of Hooligan and don't realize that they don't really have to do that. But even so, that's the explanation for why you're doing better, not the reason to make the decision or not make the decision. If your opponent starts to crouch block your Razor Edge Slicer, that's not really a reason to not do it. And that is why getting focused on winning can be bad for you, because it skews your perception of what is useful and what is not in a match. A bit too heavily for most people to easily recover from mentally. So with just the walking in the spacing, you've gone from this being nearly impossible to what may turn out to be a 3-round straight.
Did. Yes.
But the reason this comes down to imitation and why it's so important is that whenever you do want to imitate someone, you need to imitate the entire style first to see why it works, and then pick and choose which parts of it you want to incorporate into your own. You can't just go, oh, I'm going to use this piece that I've seen to solve this problem I'm facing, and then find yourself completely messed up because the psychology of the approach is no longer complete. You've just got a disjointed approach in terms of how you're thinking about it. Even if you don't have a disjointed approach in terms of what you're actually doing. The reason this is important is because if you have a disjointed approach to an opponent and they pick up on that, they will start to pick you apart, not because what you're doing is wrong, but because they have learned what it is they need to stop you from being able to do it properly.
Right. Yeah, because if they can stop one part of it, but you don't have the next part that matches that, it doesn't help you.
For example, your fighting style, even whether or not you're playing yours or mine, it is heavily picked apart by basically Ed hitting stand heavy kick and sweep in neutral. Because the range that you stand at, both when you're playing your own style of Kami and mimicking my style of Kami, which the only difference between them primarily is where you attempt to respond. Ed cares about neither of those things. Ed can just hit stand heavy kick. Because as you can see, you can't do anything about that. And getting the feeling that you must do something about it quickly results in losing, specifically because you are watching for it. You didn't counter with a change to your own style.
So
while it's not as simple as just hitting stand heavy kick whenever she wants to, Amara can sort of mess you up with it. In fact, she's more dangerous by all the time she's standing at the range to do it but not doing it, because that will make you twitchy. Now, how you deal with it, and this is what the point I was making, how you deal with that comes down to which style you're playing. In your style, the response to that is much different than in mine. In your original Kami style, your response is to block, not move, do nothing.
Not useful at all.
In the Kami style you were picking up, once you got a little further into it, you did things like hit stand light kick and stand medium punch. This allowed you to get closer in. Oh, and of course the stand heavy punch, but I don't suggest it against that particular move. But since my style is not built around getting close enough to meaningfully do that, I have to have a different response altogether.
So what is yours?
My response is to neutral jump.
Huh. I
Because
see.
Cammy has some really good buttons when she's falling out of a neutral jump, relative to anyone approaching her. Her medium punch alone is probably one of the best blocking normals in the game when it comes to someone is coming toward me but I'm in the air.
Yes, I suppose it really would be, wouldn't it?
And because it also doesn't specifically push Cammy forward too far. There are a lot of moves, especially grounded stuff that isn't like Shoryuken level, where they'll whiff entirely even though it looks like they should hit her. So if you're playing my style and you're facing the constant sweep and stand heavy kick and neutral and those problems, yeah, your best bet is just hop. Just get up in the air and stay there a little bit. Because you see, everything else you do while you're worried about the stand heavy kick opens you up for a bunch of other stuff that Ed normally wants to do.
Sure.
But once you do that, because Ed doesn't have very great ground approaches that are safe enough to just pull out, he doesn't really have anything there. I think if he charges his V skill, even the aerial one, you will, if he tries to do it on reaction to you neutral jumping, you will slip out of it before he can actually grab you. And that never goes into anything from there. And that's the important part. The reason that I would have done that, it does not work on Chun-Li, but it does work on Colleen. And this is why I know it. If I jump on Colleen and I hit the button at a certain timing, Ed can absolutely respond with Psycho Rising. The problem is that Ed gets nearly nothing off this, and Psycho Rising's damage is terrible. But if Ed happens to be in the wrong space, I can hit him with her jumping heavy kick or her jumping medium punch and set up a lot of stuff that makes his life miserable. Whereas all he gets off of me is like, okay, good, I stopped you from doing the thing. Is that really helpful? No. Then Ed has to attempt to make a decision. Am I going to try to get even closer, which was not working out for me before, or am I going to try to read the jump and hit a Psycho Upper or ES Psycho Upper? The problem is that if they mistime either of those things or you don't jump, terrible things happen.
Indeed. I end up worrying about, at that range if I neutral jump and Ed does nothing. Just being in a position where, well, my option set is the same, but now it's blatantly obvious, and my timing is obvious and all of that.
Right.
I suppose the answer to that is patience in a way.
No, it's actually more so the entire point of the exercise. The way you play, the way you view your opponent naturally, leads to that being the correct feeling for you. So if I told you, oh, just neutral jump and hit medium punch or something, that would be wrong because you're... Right now it's correct because you're playing to mimic my style. If you played in your own and still had the same problem, it would be a terrible idea. Because it hasn't changed your level of twitchiness. Nor has it changed the range that Ed wants to stand at. And you can't just immediately neutral jump again. And the button you naturally think of hitting after that is one that loses to pretty much everything Ed does.
What
But
do you hit after it?
Generally, I believe you would have hit crouch medium punch after you landed. Or crouch medium kick, which is worse.
So what's your answer then?
Hooligan.
Yeah, I really don't do that randomly in the same way. It's not random, but...
The
I
reason
would never
for
have thought of that.
the reason for the hooligan
Okay.
isn't specifically because, oh, Ed can't react to this, or this is a terrible thing for Ed to have to deal with. The hooligan is done because I can then control a lot of things. Ed has to figure out which anti-air to use, and he has to be sure that me leaving the ground, if the player happened to be watching my feet, he has to be sure that me leaving the ground wasn't another neutral jump. He also has to be sure that it wasn't a forward jump that was going to turn it into an instant cannon strike.
Sure.
Not that I would use that one very much, but it's there as an option for someone who responds all the time with a particular thing.
Yeah, okay.
But your twitchiness is based around seeing what could happen and preempting that thing.
Yes.
Whereas mine is based around assuming that nothing is going to happen, and therefore that I must initiate something, that I must lure my opponent into making a mistake.
I see. And those two are quite different, really.
So similarly, in this matchup, if you're mimicking me, the response you need in order to get it done... Ooh, quite laggy.
Extremely so, yes.
The response that you need in order to defeat Urian with my style versus defeating Urian with your style is vastly different, which is why I haven't given you any instruction at all. I don't even want to risk that you take what I say back to your own style because it would be so incorrect.
I see.
Cleared up now? Cleared up now.
Mostly.
Because in my version of this, I need to build meter. I need to build meter as quickly as I can so that I can't be zoned.
I see.
However, this is not the reaction you need to have for your style.
Yes.
So based on that, and since we're coming close to the end of stream, I will in fact tell you, but I do not suggest that you even bother trying to implement it.
Okay.
When you are mimicking my style and running into this sort of situation, the easiest answer to him doing this is to dash. You can mix up between dashing and doing nothing and dashing and throwing. But your aim is always dash, because if Urian responds with anything special at all to movement, he has to eventually build up a new charge. It's not specifically difficult to do this, but with Cammy, you can do a lot about his attempts to do that. You can do some really, really annoying things. You can dash up throw, you can dash up do nothing, and you can dash up light kick cannon spike.
Dash up light kick cannon spike, huh? One more thing not in my standard mindset processes at all.
And it should not be.
Indeed.
Because the way you think about the game, as I said, is hitting buttons to preempt something your opponent is going to try to do. So when you dash up, the ratio of times where I will actually do the light kick cannon spike is much less than the ratio of times when you're likely to do it.
Right. Because I would be expecting them to act, whereas you would not be in the same way. It's still interesting to think about the difference.
However, as I said, I don't play Cammy because, and this is the final lesson of this stream and why it's super important, something that you have to learn online, but it is no longer the sort of advice you get because arcades are no longer a thing. You cannot afford literally in terms of quarters back then, you cannot afford to play a character where your natural fighting style is risky to you. Because in an arcade, you never know who your opponent is going to be. You always have to be ready to adapt at high speed, and adaptation has to be based on something. You must start from whatever you naturally play like already and move toward some adaptation that helps you win.
Yes.
Were we in an arcade, you would have spent way more money than Nightmare by now.
Yeah. I had gone over budget and then gone home.
So
you
the reason
a lot of quarters in an arcade, though.
Yeah. So the reason why I can't actually play Cammy is because the buttons that Cammy needs to hit and the methods that Cammy has to use for particular things are much less safe than Chun-Li's versions. They're also much easier to counter by reaction and by the natural reaction. Chun-Li stuff, you tend to be at least confusing enough, especially if your spacing is good, that your opponent can't be absolutely sure they're going to get away with whatever it is they want to do. With Cammy, it's really straightforward. They might react too early and you might catch them, but it's nowhere near as devastating as trying to figure out where Chun-Li is going to land after her reverse air flip kick.
Yeah, that's a pain even when I know exactly what's going on.
And you could easily have the response of, fine, I'll just jab her out of the air and solve the problem, but then I haven't taken that much damage. And I'm sure I can convince you not to do that in some other way, relatively quickly.
It would not surprise me.
So, whereas Cosmic Wolf, for example, was able to play Nikali at the beginning, simply not being able to just sometimes go, you know what, I'm going to stand over here and electrocute you, and that will be my entire game plan. Because why should I do anything else? The inability to do that as a general thing means that against an opponent who knows how to counter Nikali well, he has no natural backup plan.
Sure.
But fortunately for you, as you will notice if you try to apply this, not necessarily my style, but just the way of thinking about it, Cammy is slightly out of phase for you, but Karine is completely in sync. Because the way that Karine approaches people is specifically based on the idea that they're going to do something. Every single move Karine does either hits before they can, evades anything they can do and then hits them, or doesn't actually end up where they would expect her in the first place. This was something that made Ibuki playable for you, and why I think that if you were to develop a full Ibuki style based on the Karine one, you could have a chance of seriously playing her again. But a lot of what Karine does is simply about, you know what, just Seppo. Not specifically because Seppo is invincible, not specifically because Seppo will win, but because your instinct tells you, my opponent is going to do something now, I should act.
Yes.
And Seppo covers both the situation in which they do something and most of the situations in which they do nothing.
Yes. With Orochi coming out of it.
Not only Orochi, but the fact that you simply can't do another move until Seppo is done means that Karine herself limits your ability to twitch and get yourself counter hit.
Oh! I had not considered that. But I can see how it makes sense, though. And
That
then
is
by the time I'm done with Seppo properly, I've had time to... Either they're not doing anything, and I maybe just have to block or such at the end, depending on how they play, or I've had time to process for a few frames what they did do or what they're trying to do, and my Twitch can be a more informed one.
yes.
You can get that second layer of check.
Whereas with Cammy, the only way you have to quickly do the same thing is basically EX. Spiral arrows. So you are... When you find yourself facing that scenario of an opponent who is making you twitchy, you might come out on top sometimes if you happen to hit the right button at the right time.
Yeah.
But most of the time it's the fact that you must choose between doing EX, Spiral Arrow, and going for Turn Knuckle. And as you get better at the game and learn to distinguish when you should do one or the other much faster, because even if the opponent is unfamiliar, you can usually at least figure out which one of those two things should happen within a short space of time. Once you have that information, you'll be much better at playing Cammy.
I see.
And you can use your Karine style to mimic that same situation of recognizing, okay, what is it that I'm feeling here with Karine? Because now you don't have to think about it. You just hit Seppo regardless. But that gives you enough time, just a few frames, to think about, why did I hit Seppo? Did I hit Seppo because I was sure they were going to attack and I was going into an attack of my own? Or did I hit Seppo to get through something? And from there you'll be able to figure out when to use your two different options on Cammy, and your Cammy game will improve.
I see. Which is simple enough, because that same distinction is extremely straightforward in Cammy with the two moves. I just have to decide earlier with her than I do with Karine. Or rather, learn to split the feeling immediately, rather than necessarily slightly option selecting it with those few extra frames.
Well, this has been one of our longer streams than usual. Fortunately,
So it has.
it probably won't show up like that in the Twitch videos, given that we got started late.
Yes.
But we have gone later than normal as well. So, shoutouts to Nightmare for joining us for basically the entire lounge. And
Indeed.
helping greatly in the fact of simply being consistent and giving us the ability to talk about many things.
Yes, he has been a very helpful guest.
So shouldn't be too surprised if they get possibly some CFN contact from us. But at this point, we're definitely getting close to wrapping up the stream. And I think based on that, this is probably the last match, or if you want one more chance to fight Nightmare, we will go exactly that far.
Let's do that.
Now the problem with Ed trying to approach Urian is basically that the only way you're going to get this done is by scoring a knockdown in some other way and closing the distance rapidly with Psycho Knuckle. Not to mediate, not even to hit with it. Just knock him down, preferably by throw, and Psycho Knuckle immediately just so you can stay close to him. This isn't necessarily because Ed being close to Urian is a super great idea for Ed, but simply that it's so hard to deal with the situation otherwise. that you just have to take the risk most of the time. Fortunately, Psycho Knuckle is safe, so unless Urien has something that he can pop out at you within the time frame, and you can be assured that he basically does not have any such things, you don't have to worry about it. Because this is a real struggle. This is truly the grind. It is literally worse than Zangief having to do it, because at least Zangief has Lariat. But Ed has no way to change his aerial mobility. He does have one method, but I'm not really sure. I've never studied in depth whether or not getting hit by a fireball and V-reversaling is a reasonable way in on Urien. But the main reason why this works so well is actually something that is not so intuitive in itself. If you stay close to Urien and Urien quickly backs off from you, he can't throw the fireball. He's not at the correct range. This is the correct range. But if you've gotten in on him enough and the Urien is zoning you heavily, you can just immediately jump. The problem is that Urien is so good at keeping Ed away from him as a general thing. Cross-ups don't work, spacing doesn't work. The struggle is real. But not so bad that you have to consider a counterpick. I wouldn't assume anyone was going to go, well, I'm not picking Ed against Urien, but I don't think anyone would ever have Ed as a secondary and then find themselves thinking, yeah, I should change to Ed for this matchup.
Huh. In any case, it seems I may or may not get another nightmare, but this will do as well, I suppose. So.
Round one. Fight.
Unfortunate instances of lag there.
I see.
See?
I've just realized something else that I should know in addition to all that. Because as I don't play either character, I've never particularly thought about it before at this level. The reason it's so important is actually because in order to achieve the same thing Karin does, Cammy has to stand slightly further away.
Huh. About where?
There. The reason being that, yes, Spiral Arrow does manage to go where it needs to be really fast, so it's not that you have to worry about that part.
Sure.
But Turn Knuckle is much more likely to be punished by a hit before you arrive if you're closer.
Sure. Fair enough.
So whereas Karine is generally hit medium kick, instantly do whatever, or you, at least you don't have to move forward or backward, Cammy either has to walk backwards slightly after the stand medium kick, or assume that the opponent has done so. And that changes a lot of things because it then defines who you can fight that way and who you cannot fight that way easily. But that's something that, again, leads into yet another level of experience and skill and all those things.
Let's see, your answer to this would be... I can't even type it.
So while you two proceed with that, well, more so depending on the ending of this match. There you go. Situation was in your favor for a moment, and might still be again. Not quite.
Darn it. Didn't get that EX off. I don't remember what I was worried about actually, but... Alright then. So it seems that I will not in fact get to say goodbye to our lovely Fong friend, and so I believe that it marks the end of the stream.
Depends. If they confirm one more time while I set up the release information.
Well, I'm not up, so... Okay.
Well, if they saw that in time, it may influence their character decision. Or maybe they just will prefer to play Nash against regardless.
What were you checking exactly?
No, I was simply adding the thanks for everything and similar.
Ah. I see. I missed that.
I'll keep that to the beyond that to the end so that we can properly watch the match.
This Nash would be so much trouble for me right now.
Ooh, very close. As usual, the sheep appreciates the good match. Yep, straight zoning in every direction. Unfortunately, not that familiar and came out of that early. There's the clip down. That one turned out to be too close. Unfortunate.
I suggest you stay down.
Well, not unfortunate for Nightmare, of course.
Fight.
This is unfortunately one of those matches where a zoner finds himself in a situation against another zoner who has a specific set of skills, and at that point their best bet would always be to actually just use their V reversal, because the situation isn't going to fix itself unless they get back to the zoning scenario. But that is obviously a perfect ending to the stream. And so we'll be closing out the Battle Lounge and letting everyone go. And if anyone wants to continue along with Nightmare, most likely it will change to be their lounge.
Okay.
So for all viewers, please note that at the end of this week, Sunday, as usual, we should be releasing Urian bot at 2-mk.org. Urian bot will count as one of our easy bots, but this is more so because it is about learning specific spacings than because we consider Urian to be easy to fight. The more complicated parts of Urian you're going to have to work out on your own probably. So with that said, we bid you good night and hope you can stop by tomorrow to actually get a look at it.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for watching.